Mary Magdalene is the Bible's key witness to one of the most important events in history, the resurrection of Jesus. Without her, Christianity might not exist. Yet we know almost nothing about the real Mary Magdalene.
She's definitely the mystery woman.
The early church branded her a whore.
I think everyone has the potential to be a harlot, to be a sinner.
Popular fiction recast her as the wife of Jesus and the mother of his child.
In the modern imagination, of course, Jesus and Mary Magdalene are not only close, they're intimate.
But beneath the layers of myth lies a hidden truth about what really happened on the day the Bible says Jesus rose from the dead. A secret that had to be kept for Christianity to be born.
The Gospels wanted to remove Mary from the scene and make her irrelevant.
One that made Mary Magdalene a very inconvenient woman. "2,000 years after her death, Mary Magdalene's name is everywhere. Yet she remains the most mysterious woman in history. To some, she's a prostitute forgiven by Jesus, the sinner who became a saint. To others, she's the true Holy Grail. In the Bible's New Testament, she plays a starring role in the foundation of Christianity, but its Gospels give very little details about her, saying only that she came from Galilee, supported Jesus, and was once possessed by demons.
The case of Mary Magdalene in the Gospels is just very, very odd in that she just suddenly shows up in the earliest Gospel, the end of Mark, and she's at the cross. And all we're told is she's with this group of women who came from Galilee.
This is the right hand of Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene could be little more than a relic of history, except for one thing. The Gospels very rarely agree about who was where and when. Yet unusually, all 4 Gospels of the New Testament place Mary among the group of women present at the crucifixion. The mystery woman takes the leading role.
The most significant moment would be when she's with Christ on the cross. The other apostles left and fled because they were afraid, but she stood by Christ.
With the male disciples in hiding, only Jesus' female followers witness his execution. Mentioned first among them is Mary Magdalene. She remains with him until his death, but by doing so, she was taking a significant risk.
From other accounts, from crucifixions, it is clear that it was dangerous for family to be around, to show grief and so on. There are stories of not only male family members being crucified, but also female and even children. So it was not less dangerous for the women to be there.
Later, Mary goes to the tomb with Jesus' mother and sister to tend to his body.
It's very, very odd because if you think about it, that's very little to know about her, but a high level of intimacy. If she's with the mother of Jesus, the sister of Jesus, at the burial, washing and preparing and anointing the naked body of Jesus for the proper rites of burial, she's somehow very intimate and inside, and yet who is she? She's definitely the mystery woman.
The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John then all tell how Mary is the first to see the resurrected Jesus.
This next picture depicts her seeing the resurrected Christ. This is the actual picture of when she doesn't really realize it's him. She thinks he's the gardener. And then all of a sudden he says, Mary. And she understands that's him, the teacher, her beloved.
The resurrection is the foundation stone of Christianity. The idea transformed the Jesus movement from a minor Jewish sect into a whole new faith. According to the New Testament, Mary Magdalene is the messenger who delivers news of the resurrection to the hiding male disciples. She is the apostle to the apostles. But then, her job done, she disappears from the Bible.
One of the big mysteries of the New Testament is why Mary plays such a slight role. The gospel writers obviously knew of her as a person who was significant for understanding the resurrection of Jesus, and we know that the early Christians are making up stories about companions of Jesus during his lifetime. And so the big question is, why didn't they tell more stories about Mary Magdalene?
Post the resurrection, the gospel writers concentrate solely on the male disciples. Mary Magdalene is swiftly forgotten. Did the early church have something to hide? In the Gospels of the New Testament, Mary Magdalene is the key witness to the resurrection. Her vision of a risen Jesus inspires the male disciples to claim that their leader has returned from the dead. The Jesus movement breaks away from Judaism, and Christianity is born. Yet, amazingly, 500 years later, instead of celebrating Mary Magdalene as a founder of their faith, the Christian church branded her a whore, an image that stood the test of time.
We have here an unashamedly eroticized image of Mary Magdalene. She's here depicted in all her fleshly glory. And notice particularly the way that her arm is used to obscure her face. The entire emphasis here is on her corporeality. Her long hair flows like a river over the stone that she leans against, but there in no way is it being used to hide her nakedness.
In the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great decreed that the New Testament stories of 3 separate women in fact referred to just one individual, Mary Magdalene. One of these women, described in the Bible only as an unnamed sinner, had sought Jesus' forgiveness by washing his feet with her tears and drying them with her hair. In 1st century Judea, only a prostitute would perform such a shocking act of intimacy in public. For the next 1400 years, the unnamed sinner and Mary Magdalene were as one.
Mary Magdalene became viewed in Orthodox circles as a lapsed prostitute. So in some respects, she became a role model, but certainly not for what she had wanted to become. She became a role model for Christianity who was willing to forgive sinners and sins, and particularly women, lapsed women.
But Pope Gregory's portrait of Mary Magdalene was a work of pure imagination. Nowhere in the New Testament is she ever referred to either as a prostitute or a sinner.
I don't believe she was the harlot, but let's just pretend she was. I think everyone has the potential to be a harlot, to be a sinner. We all are. I mean, at every moment we do things that aren't exactly right. We make bad judgments. We're human. Even pretending or assuming she was the harlot would even make her greater. So for me, it wouldn't be a deterrent. It would be actually more of a way to, appreciate her more.
The image of the repentant Mary Magdalene was so popular that it lasted 14 centuries. Only in 1969 did the Catholic Church finally declare that she was not the unknown sinner and prostitute. But what had motivated Pope Gregory to apparently deliberately smear the reputation of Mary Magdalene? Was there perhaps something to hide?
There's no indication in the Bible that Mary Magdalene is the nameless sinner. But at the time of Gregory, he wanted to have inspiring figures for the people in a pastoral way.
Pope Gregory's motive may have been to create a role model for sinners, but he also effectively ended any debate about who Mary Magdalene was or what her role in the Jesus movement had really been. He was able to construct this new image for her simply because so little was known about her. At a time when neither men nor women had surnames and were usually distinguished from each other by association with other family members, the very name Magdalene was mysterious.
Most women are usually associated with men in their names. And I thought, well, perhaps, wasn't she married? Was she a widow? But I think you must simply conclude that in the movement in which these Gospels arose, she had no male family who was also known in the movement. The others are named Mary of James, for instance. Oh, James was known in the movement. Mary of James. Perhaps you could say that there were no male people who were associated with them. It's also not Mary of Jesus.
The word Magdalene is not a first name, and unusually doesn't associate Mary with a relative. Gives no information about her status as a wife, mother, or daughter. So where does the title come from? On the shores of the Sea of Galilee lie the remains of a first-century town, an important fishing community known as Magdala.
Magdala was famous for its fish. Its name means fish tower, or the Greek name means salted fish lill. Salting the fish, after salting it, it would keep, so you could export it to the entire Mediterranean world.
In the first century, fish were an essential part of the diet, and Magdala was a major producer, famous throughout the region. Its name would be instantly recognizable. Could Mary Magdalene mean Mary of Magdala?
I'd say Mary Magdalene is a proper title for a woman who comes from the city of Magdala. And because Mary was such a popular name at the time, we would want to sort of identify her and distinguish her from the other Marys. Her place of origin would be a good way of doing that. But once she leaves it and she joins a certain group, she is the Mary from Magdala in this group.
It seems likely that Mary Magdalene came from the Galilean town of Magdala. Archaeological excavations there are still at an early stage. But further along the coast at Bethsaida, the biblical home of disciples Peter, Andrew, and Philip, archaeologist Rami Arav has spent 20 years excavating a similar Galilean fishing community. He believes it offers clues to Mary Magdalene's early life.
What we encounter in the dig is a community of people who lived here in very humble, simple buildings. Their homes were not sophisticated. Their homes were almost fairly similar to each other. There is no mosaic floors, no marble on the walls, nothing of this kind. I would expect Magdala to be not much better than what we see here in Bethsaida.
Mary's childhood in Magdala would have been overshadowed by the might of Rome. Galilee was a hotbed of political activity, some of it violent, and the Romans had crushed frequent revolts in and around Magdala. Reminders of Roman oppression were very close to home. Some 40 years or so before Mary's birth, a large number of Galilean rebels and their families were caught hiding in the caves of Mount Arbel above Magdala. Herod the Great, appointed King of the Jews by the Romans, was determined to get rid of them. The Jewish historian Josephus recorded what happened next.
Herod at first doesn't know how to deal with the situation. They seem so well defended inside those caves, and how do you get to them? Finally, he resorted to a trick, Josephus tells us, fraught with the utmost danger. He lowers the best of his soldiers in cradles from the top downward, and they attack the families from these cradles. Josephus tells the story of one family, a father and mother with 7 sons, and the father refused to surrender. Instead, this old man, Josephus tells us, takes each of his sons one by one, drags him out of the cave, and throws him down into the abyss. After the 7 sons, finally throwing down his wife as well, and then he leaps to his own death. Mary would have heard these stories from her grandparents and from her parents, and every time she looked at these caves, she would have remembered this one example of the many examples of Roman oppression in the Galilee.
I think that growing up in Magdalene, growing up anywhere in Judea or Palestine at the time, Jews felt Roman influence, Roman government, Roman colonialism, were aware of it, couldn't ignore it. There were the soldiers out there in the street who could pose any sort of danger for anybody, especially for women. I'm sure Mary Magdalene was well aware of it. I have no doubt that she was not very sympathetic to it.
Magdala was at the heart of rebel Galilee, and Jewish resistance movements sprung up all around the region. Many preached armed rebellion. The Jesus movement was different, but the lessons of history were clear. When she joined, Mary must have known that she risked the wrath of Rome.
Jesus has a different teaching. His teaching does say, yes, Rome will be overthrown. The last shall be first. The meek shall inherit the earth. This is definitely a revolutionary teaching, but it's not a military teaching. And in the kind of community that Jesus indicates he wants to build around him, women can have a much more active role than they can in a military movement.
The headquarters of the Jesus movement lay just 5 kilometers away from Magdala, across the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum, said to be the home of the disciple Peter. The New Testament doesn't say how or when Mary met Jesus, but the easiest way to travel between the Galilean towns was by boat. In the early 1970s, a mosaic of a first-century fishing boat was found in an archaeological dig at Magdala. Remarkably, in 1986, the shrinking waters of the lake revealed the remains of just such a vessel preserved in the mud. The oldest freshwater boat ever found.
The boat is dated 1st century, so it's more than 2,000 years old. And I think the boat was used for transportation and fishing. You could use a boat much easier than walk around the lake, especially 2,000 years ago, because now you see roads. There are good roads, but in those days the roads were not very good. And it's a very, very rocky area. So boats are the easiest way to go from place to place.
Could such a boat have brought Mary and Jesus together?
Also in the New Testament, it's written many times, people went from Capernaum to Magdala by boat. And it's very logical and very likely they would have done that. And the boat is from the time of Maria Magdalena. That we know for sure. And it's very likely that she saw this boat. So I cannot say for sure if she used the boat, but I presume she saw the boat.
Many were drawn to Jesus by his revolutionary message. The New Testament's only clue as to why Jesus and Mary came together is in the Gospel of Luke, which states that Mary Magdalene was a woman from whom 7 demons were cast out.
Now, the text doesn't actually say that Jesus was the one who cast out the demons, but most people assume that that's what it means, that Jesus had exorcised her.
In the Bible, 7 is the perfect number, signifying completeness. If Mary was afflicted by 7 demons, then she would have been totally possessed. Could demonic spirits have driven her to Jesus? And if so, what were they?
First of all, we have to ask, what does it mean that she has demons? I can imagine various explanations for it. One of them, I could say that maybe she was epileptic. When a person is epileptic, he seems to be possessed. When he or she has a seizure, this looks like possession. Or she could be schizophrenic, in which case the various characters that sort of come out in her may be seen as demons that possess her.
Yet strangely, only the Gospel of Luke alleges Mary Magdalene was afflicted by demons. The accusation appears nowhere else in the Bible, and many scholars ask whether Luke deliberately fabricated the story to undermine Mary's later role in the Jesus movement.
It's very odd that he does not tell a story about this. It could have been a beautiful story. Some woman being liberated from 7 demons. Luke has several stories about people being freed from demons. So you really don't know what Luke means by it.
I don't think we know that Mary was possessed. I think that making her possessed is a way for the person who's writing the gospel, for the apostle, to somehow signal to us that there is something not quite right with this woman. And so, of course, whatever she does and whatever she says, we take it with some sort of reservation, which is derived from the fact that she is actually, sort of sick.
The Gospel of Luke seems to have made a deliberate attempt to cast doubt on Mary's reliability. But in Luke and in the Gospel of Mark, there are 2 more important clues. Mary is mentioned first among a group of women from Galilee who offer financial support to Jesus.
Now that's an interesting clue, because her name seems to say she's from Magdala, up in the Galilee, the city, and does she have some money? She's alone, she doesn't seem to be married, but does she have some funds? Is she a sort of backer of the Jesus movement?
According to Jewish law, women do not inherit. They are maintained by their fathers and then by their husbands. And so, in fact, you could say, how could a woman have money at all? But in reality, we have evidence for all kinds of stories where men go to great lengths to provide property for their daughters or wives where the law would not have expected them to do so.
Any wealth Mary had was almost certainly held in the form of property. But could that generate enough money to finance Jesus and his followers?
How wealthy you have to be in order to support one person who has very humble needs. He was not, after all, a prince. It was not a very big deal to support somebody like him.
Not only may Mary Magdalene have helped finance the Jesus movement, but she also seems to have taken a leading role among the women from Galilee.
She's not just any woman, she's a woman that has the means to support him, follows him down to Galilee, but somehow puts herself right at the head in terms of that group.
Did Mary Magdalene play a prominent part in the Jesus movement? Jesus was set on a collision course with Rome and the Jewish state. Being close to him was tantamount to an act of revolution. Once she joined him, there was no going back. But was she more than just a follower? For nearly 2,000 years, all that was known about Mary Magdalene was contained in a few lines of text in the Gospels of the New Testament. But then, in 1945, a remarkable find near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt changed everything. A group of local farmers were digging for fertilizer when they uncovered an ancient sealed jar. Inside, they found 12 leather-bound books. Among the texts were Gospels, credited to some of the disciples, but left out of the New Testament. Only recently translated, they have revolutionized scholars' understanding of early Christianity.
I was very intrigued when I got to know these writings that portray Mary Magdalene in the Nag Hammadi find, because she is portrayed as a disciple. She's called a disciple with other women, and she is portrayed as asking questions of Jesus, and he is answering her, and then she's reacting again. So it is very, you get a new image of Mary Magdalene.
The lost Gospels gave Mary a far more prominent role than she plays in the New Testament. And one of the texts, the Gospel of Philip, offered what appeared to be a shocking revelation about the relationship between Jesus and Mary.
The Gospel of Philip is one of these books from the ancient world which over time was eroded away, and there are holes in the manuscript, gaps where there used to be words that have now disappeared, and that happens to affect this particular passage. Let me read the passage to you as we actually have it in the Gospel of Philip. What it says is this: "And the companion of the," then there's a gap in the manuscript, "Mary Magdalene," gap in the manuscript, "her," more than gap, "the disciples," gap, "kiss her," gap, "on her," gap.
By examining how the writer of the Gospel of Philip used language elsewhere in the text, scholars have been able to make a reasonable guess at what the missing words may be.
In some translations, they say, well, at least Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene on the mouth and very often. You can make a lot of beautiful erotic conclusions about that. But I think, first of all, you must admit that the space where mouth is filled in is a loose space. There are no letters. So you could fill in every word that fits. Feet, has someone proposed, cheek, whatever.
If Jesus did kiss Mary upon the mouth, or even elsewhere on her body, as the Gospel of Philip alleges, then could that imply a sexual relationship between the two? Could Mary and Jesus even have been married?
Some people say, well, but the fact that he's kissing her, doesn't that show that they have an intimate relationship? And one would think that unless one read the rest of the Gospel of Philip, because as it turns out, kissing is referred to elsewhere in the Gospel of Philip. And the way it's referred to elsewhere is in relationship to the Christian ritual that happened during Christian worship services in the early church, where Christians would welcome one another with a kiss. And the Gospel of Philip asks, why is it that you welcome one another with a kiss? The reason is because by kissing, you're showing that revelation has been given. God gives his revelation by delivering his word. Words are delivered by the mouth. And so Christians kiss one another to show that they're giving revelation to one another.
All the disciples kissed each other to share the grace. So I don't think you should make something erotic out of it. It would be our interpretation.
In recent years, novels and movies have gone much further and imagined at the time of the crucifixion, Mary was pregnant with Jesus' child.
It's widely thought today among people who have paid attention to the popular press and to novels like The Da Vinci Code that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had an intimate relationship. From a historical point of view, speaking simply as a historian, this kind of claim looks to be completely bogus. There is no reference in any early source of any kind of Jesus and Mary being married, for example, or having sex and having babies.
In the novel The Da Vinci Code, Mary Magdalene and her daughter flee to Provence in France after the crucifixion. It's a story built upon an ancient Provençal tradition, but one that has nothing to do with Mary bearing the child of Jesus.
We became very famous when Dan Brown wrote the book, but I don't think, we don't have this vision here in south of France. The Provençal people think that she's very different from the book.
Could the Provençal tradition provide a clue to Mary's true role in the Jesus movement? Each year, the supposed skull of Mary Magdalene, covered by a golden mask, is paraded through the streets of the small French town Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume. The tradition goes back to 1279, when the Count of Provence claimed to have discovered Mary Magdalene's remains beneath the town's small church. With the blessing of the Pope, he built a huge basilica on the site of her tomb. Modern forensics have cast doubt on the authenticity of the relic, but the tradition of Mary Magdalene arriving in France survives.
The figure of Mary Magdalene is very popular, not only in religion, in religious life, but also in social life. For example, Mary Magdalene is the patron saint of perfumers and of jewelers. Here in Provence, when someone is crying, we say they're crying like Magdalene.
Sancta Maria Magdalena.
According to this story, Mary Magdalene and other refugees from the Holy Land were cast adrift on a rudderless boat and swept ashore on the coast of Provence. Tradition holds that she began converting the local people to Christianity before eventually retiring to a cave in the local mountains.
The tradition in Provence is that 7 times a day she's raised up to the heavens by angels. And I think this is an indication she has mystic experiences. And 7 times a day means a perfection. She was a perfect mystic.
The tradition of Mary as mystic has been reflected in art for centuries, and hints at a deeper understanding of Mary Magdalene's vision of Jesus.
Notice the way that her eyes are focused on the book, not the crucifix. This tells us that this is something she is seeing in her mind's eye. This is not a physical vision that she's experiencing.
Mary's importance as a visionary and a woman who posed a distinct threat to a male-dominated church dates back to the earliest days of Christianity in yet another lost gospel deliberately omitted from the New Testament. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a series of finds in Egypt revealed a remarkable text that gave Mary a far greater role in the Jesus movement. The only gospel ever discovered attributed to a woman. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene.
In the Gospel of Mary, Mary is given a position of prominence that she simply doesn't have in our earliest gospel sources.
The author of the Gospel of Mary is convinced that Mary Magdalene is the one who understood more of Jesus than the other disciples. And perhaps it might be historical that Mary Magdalene understood more, or understood, as I always thought, understood the message of Jesus in a different way.
In the Gospels of the New Testament, men take the leading role. Women are peripheral to the story. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene and other lost Gospels placed Mary, a woman, at the very center of the Jesus movement. But was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene right? Could a woman really have been active in the early church? In 2005, archaeologist Yotam Tepe made an amazing discovery inside a maximum security prison at Megiddo in Israel. The remains of a church, or prayer hall, believed to be from the early 3rd century and possibly the oldest Christian church in the world. Even more remarkable, it was in part paid for by a woman.
This we call it the Christian inscription, okay? It says, Akeptus is the name of a woman. She's loving the God, and she offered a table to the God Jesus Christ as a memorial.
In early Christianity, the centerpiece of a church or prayer hall was a table rather than an altar. The Megiddo inscription shows that a woman called Akeptos donated the table to the prayer hall, evidence that women took an active role in the early church.
If a woman offered the table, so she is involved in what happened in this prayer hall, this building, in this Christian community.
At the entrance to the prayer hall, another mosaic commemorates 4 more women. The mosaics at Megiddo prove that less than 200 years after the death of Jesus, women played an important role in the Christian church. But in the prayer hall, all the female names are on one side of the building and all the male names are on the other. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene also reveals divisions between men and women as Mary struggles to tell her story.
She is portrayed as a disciple, but also as a disciple who teaches the other disciples when Jesus is gone. She is simply asked to tell about what she knows about Jesus. She tells about it, and then the men are debating among themselves. Is she to be believed? Can you listen to a woman? So this is really a gender thing.
The Gospel of Mary Magdalene and some of the Gospels from Nag Hammadi give Mary a far more prominent role in the Jesus movement and often picture her struggling to be heard against a male hierarchy. But these texts, sometimes called the Gnostic Gospels, were written to promote an alternative view of Christianity.
They're called Gnostic Gospels because they represent a point of view that scholars have called Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a religion that was in many ways similar to Christianity and had a lot of Christian elements in it, in which the proponents of this religion insisted that salvation came not by having faith, but by having knowledge, which in Greek is gnosis.
In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and other Gnostic texts, Mary's name was used to represent views that were a clear challenge to the Orthodox line, portraying Mary in heated argument with Peter, the disciple who tradition says became the first pope of Rome. The New Testament and the Gnostic Gospels each promoted their own version of Christianity. Perhaps neither could be relied upon to give a definitive picture of Mary Magdalene.
This conflict in the Gospel of Mary between Peter and his form of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and Mary representing some kind of Gnostic Christianity, this is a later Gnostic fabrication. The historical Peter and the historical Mary probably were not that far apart in what they understood about Jesus. But in later Christianity, Christian leaders and teachers tried to ascribe their own views to early followers of Jesus. And so Orthodox Christians claimed that their views came from Peter, and some Gnostic Christians claimed that their views came from Mary.
In the first 300 years or so after Jesus' death, there were more than 80 different texts in existence that spoke about his life and teaching. By the 4th century, the Church had settled on a list of 27 approved texts, including the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which would be admitted into the New Testament. All others, including the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which did not fit the doctrine of the Orthodox Church, were deemed heretical and never to be read or copied again. The only information that survived about Mary Magdalene was contained in a few short lines of the New Testament. Over the centuries, she would be reinvented time and time again. But one question remained unanswered. What had the key witness to the resurrection really seen outside the empty tomb? For 2,000 years, Mary Magdalene has been the mystery woman of the Bible, trapped in an information vacuum, endlessly reinvented down the centuries to suit the needs of the age. But her real importance revolves around what happened during those few brief moments 20 centuries ago. Because what she saw that morning was the basis for the formation of Christianity. Did she experience a vision or witness a full bodily resurrection?
What did Mary see? I think that at the least one can claim that Mary had some kind of vision after Jesus' death. There's nothing at all implausible about that. People see the dead all the time. The elderly man sees his wife in his bedroom a month after she's died. It's extremely well documented. And my hunch is that Mary Magdalene had a vision of Jesus after he died. That she interpreted this apparently as a vision that he'd come back to life, but it may simply have been a post-mortem experience of somebody who'd previously died.
Since the earliest days, many question the story being told by members of the Jesus movement.
In the 2nd century, there is this person, this philosopher Celsus. He looks at the resurrection story and makes fun of it, so to speak. And then he says, well, why should you believe a hysterical woman?
Of course, if it was only a hysterical woman who saw the resurrection, it's not a very believable story. And so if you get more reliable male members of the movement having witnessed something similar, then you can really start taking it seriously. And that could also be a reason why the Gospels and later sources also wanted to remove Mary from the scene and make her irrelevant.
Mary Magdalene appeared to have experienced some form of vision of Jesus, but the fact that she was a woman was hugely inconvenient for the Jesus movement. A single woman's testimony was never going to be enough to convince a skeptical population that Jesus had bodily risen from the dead. So did the male disciples distort Mary's story to further their cause?
I don't think personally that what happened was that someone like Mary said, I saw Jesus, and the disciples were calculating and thinking, oh, well, then we can use this and we can start a religion on this basis. I don't think it started like that. I think that maybe if somebody had a vision of Jesus, maybe somebody else then was encouraged psychologically to have a vision of Jesus, and various people had visions of Jesus then, and this became enough for people to start saying, Jesus is no longer dead.
But visions alone would not have been enough to convince doubters that an actual bodily resurrection had taken place. To do that, his corpse would have to be missing. What was needed was an empty tomb.
We don't know how Jesus was buried. In the accounts of the New Testament, he's buried by Joseph of Arimathea in his private tomb. More commonly, Romans allowed a person who was crucified simply to rot on the cross, and then tossed his remains in a common burial ground. And so my hunch is that Christianity began with these visions, and that only later was there a tradition that developed that he was put in a tomb and the tomb was empty.
With the myth of the empty tomb and plenty of male sightings in place, the story of a risen Jesus was now far more believable. Mary Magdalene's role in the resurrection could now be safely downplayed. She may have had the first vision, but what was important now was the testimony of the male disciples.
What if she was the first witness? What if it all came from her? That could be coming through the oral tradition. So you can't write her out, but you can contextualize her with all the other appearances, and then, you know, yeah, she was there first, but then he really appeared to the men and got the business done.
The Gospels of the New Testament were written 30 to 70 years after Jesus' death. By then, oral traditions about Mary Magdalene as first witness may have been too well embedded to dismiss completely. But the Gospel writers had no need to say any more about her. The early church could even afford to cast doubt upon her character. But if the story of the empty tomb really was a later invention, then the case for the resurrection and the very foundation of the Christian faith rests on just one person's vision, Mary Magdalene's.
I tend to think that Mary Magdalene is the real founder of Christianity. And Christianity is the movement that believes that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, was buried, and resurrected on the third day. And of course, Jesus couldn't have come up with this idea because he was already dead. Somebody else came up with it. And it seems to me that all the evidence points to Mary Magdalene as being the founder of this idea.
If Christianity is the belief in Jesus' death and resurrection, and she's the first to say that he got raised from the dead, one can plausibly argue that, in fact, Mary Magdalene started Christianity if she was the first. And so her importance historically is enormous, even if that's the only thing that she was known for.
I always wanted to find a diary of Mary Magdalene, but there is none. And, well, when you ask why is there so little known about her, what she was before she met Jesus, what became of her after his death and resurrection.
Mary Magdalene's importance to Christianity may not be as a leader of the movement or as Jesus' intimate companion. She may simply have been the faithful follower in the right place at the right time. The woman whose vision ultimately led to the formation of a new faith.